My name is Amber Cowie, and I am speaking to you from the shared unceded territory of the Squamish and Lil'wat First Nation, an area that is currently known as Squamish, British Columbia. I am a novelist and a freelance writer, and I would love to speak with you about my upcoming novel to be released on May 3rd, called Last One Alive, and how I used indigenous myth and settler history to create the legend of a mythical witch, which drives my plot forward and is the through line of the entire story. At the end of this video, I'm hoping that you have a sense of how to embed your own inspiration into whatever story it is that you hope to tell. Inspiration comes in many forms from many different places, often places that are very surprising. And the evolution of that idea can end up looking extremely different than what the seed of the story was for you. I hope you get a sense of how that evolved in my own work following the end of this video, but also I hope that you feel inspired to take those pieces and those little bits of ideas that you have to make your own story. So I am going to start by doing a short reading, which will set the stage for the conversation that I'd love to have about where exactly did the myth of the Stone Witch come from in my mind, and how have I tried to honor both settler history and indigenous life and times and storytelling in my own work. So let's begin with a reading. So I'm going to do a reading from the very first pages of Last One Alive to set the scene for us as we talk about how the story behind the story was created. Penelope stopped outside the door to Marianne's apartment. She pinched the key so tightly that it bit into the pad of her thumb. Now that she was here, she couldn't bear the idea of sliding it into the lock and seeing what was inside. The scene that had been repeating in her head since she heard the news began again as her hand hovered at waist height. This fixation on a single moment was senseless, yet she couldn't shake the idea that understanding the precise mechanics of her closest friend's last breath would finally allow her to accept the unbearable truth. Marianne was dead. In her mind, Penelope heard the thump of her friend's body hitting the floor, heavy and thick as the final beat of a heart. According to several witnesses who had seen Marianne drop dead at the front of her classroom, it had happened fast. The 32-year-old had collapsed while delivering a lecture to her college history class. A brain aneurysm, according to the lawyer. One of the students had described it as surreal. Penelope agreed. Since she'd heard of Marianne's death, the whole world had seemed like a terrible simulation. If someone like her could die in a way like that, how could Penelope trust anything ever again? When the playback loop ended, Penelope forced the tumblers apart with the key and pushed the door open. She didn't enter immediately. It still felt as though she should wait for an invitation. She counted to 4 as she breathed in deeply. When no call of welcome came, she stepped over the threshold. Penelope's chest grew tight at the sight of the sun-filled one-bedroom apartment where she'd spent so many afternoons and evenings. She smelled lemons and a faint hint of strong coffee as she looked around at her friend's belongings. Paintings, a vase, throw pillows, books. Before Marianne's death, the objects had seemed like a legend of her life, signifiers and set pieces for all the things her friend hadn't had time to tell her in the 2 years they'd known each other. Now, all those stories would remain untold. A flare of unexpected anger sharpened Penelope's thoughts. It was ridiculous that Marianne had not lived longer than this. It was ludicrous that 2 years after the end of the pandemic, Penelope's best friend had died from a hidden flaw in her own body. It was horrifying and insane that Penelope was the one who had to clean out her apartment. She treated it as a joke when Marianne had asked her to become the executor of her estate. What woman in her early 30s needed a will? But that was Marianne, morbidly practical, the polar opposite of Penelope with her unflagging optimism and slightly disheveled life. Marianne planned her vacations to the last detail months, sometimes even years in advance, while Penelope had once gone camping for a weekend with nothing more than a pack of veggie dogs and a sleeping bag. Marianne bought her groceries using a regimented weekly meal plan. Penelope ate peanut butter crackers for dinner most nights of the week. Marianne filed an online itinerary when she went for a hike. Penelope was proud when she remembered to bring a rain jacket to work on overcast days. Her inability to organize herself had been a sore point all her life, but Marianne had loved her spontaneity. When they were together, Penelope had finally felt like she was good enough. She'd even become confident enough to tease Marianne about not worrying about things until things actually happened. Now it turned out her friend had been right all along. Penelope couldn't help but think that if only she were more like Marianne, she might have been prepared for this. An hour before, in a wood-paneled office downtown, Marianne's estate lawyer had instructed Penelope to empty her friend's home as soon as possible. It would need to be rented again to avoid any extra expense to the estate, he explained. The fridge, the lawyer said grimly. People forget about the fridge. Penelope had nodded as she closed her hand over the jagged teeth of the key the lawyer placed on the desk. Her collar had become unpleasantly damp after the tears slid down her cheeks. Now her throat thickened again when she spotted the red notebook sitting politely closed on the otherwise empty desk by the floor-to-ceiling window at the far end of the apartment. Though its dull leather surface was deceptively innocuous, Penelope knew it was the most valuable thing in the entire apartment. The small book was the reason she'd met Marianne. It had been the subject of so many of their conversations, including their last. So as you can probably guess, the contents of that notebook are pivotal to the rest of the story as it unfolds. So 1.5 years after the death of Marianne, Penelope has successfully published her first novel to great acclaim, but her publisher is pressuring her for her second book. She has no idea what she wants to write about. So, in an act of desperation, she assembles 9 people who have some amount of expertise on the area around Howe Sound to travel with her to a remote eco lodge, which was the site of 3 horrendous murders 100 years before. A young woman, 16 years old, named Ruth Stone, was accused of being responsible for the violent deaths of both her husband and 2 detectives who came looking for her, then disappearing forever. No one saw or heard from her again. She never stood trial, and she was never convicted or was able to have her say in a court of law. Because of the nature of the deaths and the fact that she disappeared without a trace, many people in the area attributed her power to witchcraft, that she had the ability to harness the dark arts to be able to accomplish these terrible things and then never be seen again. Ruth Stone is completely fabricated. The legend of the Stone Witch was something that I came up with in my mind, and it is the driving force and the through line of this book. It's why this ragtag group of people gets together in this wilderness lodge, and it's perhaps the reason why once they arrive, terrible things start to happen to them, and one by one they begin to be harmed, killed, or disappear. So why and how did I come up with the idea of a witch? Well, it all started one day when I was with my kids at the Squamish Lilwalk Cultural Center, which is an incredible museum and cultural center for the indigenous myth, legend, art, and creations that have been part of this area since sort of time began. So as I noted when I began, this is the unceded territory of two indigenous bands, both of whom share territory because of the way that the waterways and the geography of the area work. So one of the myths, one of the governing myths of this area for the Squamish Nation was the idea of a giant woman. Sometimes she's called the witch, and if anyone's familiar with this area, there's the second largest rock granite monolith in the world is here. It's called the Squamish Chief, and it's a huge boulder that sort of resides and presides over the town. On the face of the chief, as it's called for short, is a sort of dusty, distinguishable outcropping of sandy shale. That area for climbers and locals is also known as the witch, and it comes from this myth from the Squamish Nation of this giant cannibal woman who would roam the wilderness after dark in this area. And if she found anyone, children, adults, she would stuff them in her giant sack and take them home and eat them. So I love the idea of how stories, particularly horror stories, are used to create behavioral needs for kids. So this woman, it was explained to me, was really like intended to serve as a guide for children, to help them to come home after it got dark, to keep them safe. And I found myself quite fascinated by this witchy, dark presence that lives in the woods where I live too, and sometimes go out after dark. So that was kind of like bobbing around in my mind. And then I really did want to write something about this region. And so I then went to another local cultural site called the Britannia Mine Museum, which is obviously a place that showcases much of the industrial activity that happened when the early settlers arrived. The Britannia mine was a huge copper mine that really drove a lot of the settlement that happened around the Squamish and Britannia Beach area. So as I started reading this local history collection by Bruce Ramsey and published by the Britannia Mine Museum, which is quite an interesting piece of local history, I found myself very fascinated too by some of the horrors and kind of dark stories that happened in the mine during the early days of its settlement. In particular, I was very riveted by the idea of this extremely remote mining camp where you literally had to pull yourself hand over hand in a cart to get to, and all of the incredible and sometimes horrific things that happened there, including the Jane Camp collapse, where a camp very high on the mountain one night was demolished by an incredible slide that came down from the top and almost completely covered and obliterated this camp of dozens of people, killing most of them. So if anyone from like around here is familiar with the Frank slide, where an entire community was buried under rock, it's very similar to that, but on a smaller scale. So I found myself very interested in this idea of young women and dark magic and what happened in a place like this, the place where I live, so many years ago. And in my mind, this indigenous myth of a witch began to be braided with the story of Ruth Stone, a settler, a young woman who grew up in the Britannia mine camps who then was married off to a much older man and taken to live in a very remote location across Howe Sound. So I don't know exactly where ideas come from or how much of this was about the giant cannibal woman from the Squamish Nation and how much was about mining history. I think that when you allow yourself to be immersed in stories, and maybe it's from your local landscape, maybe you're inspired by something else, your mind will take those little bits and pieces from all over and create something that is just your own. There's many ways to draw this forward as you move through your story. For me, I write everything. I have a journal, this red journal, sort of like the one that Marianne talked about, or the one that Marianne used to have, that Penelope talks about in the first opening of the book. I write a lot, I draw a lot, I think about like the different ways that things can connect, but mainly I find that these stories sort of come together when I'm least expecting it, that even though I have maybe an intention and I'm trying very hard to make something come to life, I really have no idea how it's going to be fully fleshed out once it is. But for me, that those bits of myth that I learned and the history that exists in this area became intertwined into this completely fabricated, fictionalized story of the young girl, either falsely accused or completely responsible for the violent deaths of 3 men 100 years ago. So for me, this world that we live in, it's made of stories. That's how we understand the world. It's how indigenous storytellers have helped kids not to go out late at night and potentially get harmed. It's how people in the mines entertain themselves during those dark nights when they had very little power and storms were raging. I think that if you as a storyteller are open and with your eyes and your heart and your ears to these stories that exist around you, that inspiration will flow through you, and it will hopefully become something that is so meaningful and so much more than the original telling was for you. You take those pieces from other people, from other places, from other moments in time, and you create something that's wholly your own. So I very much encourage you to absorb the stories, to write your stories, to create the world based on the stories that you know and you've been told. And I hope that one of the stories that you can pick up and absorb at some moment in time, but hopefully May 3rd, is Last One Alive by me. I hope that it is something that inspires you, and I hope that this talk has been helpful as you move forward in your creative journey. Stories are the most important and incredible thing that we have. So never, ever be afraid to tell your own.